This is the Holy Land Timeline, bringing the Bible to life from the Holy Land.
Walking the ground where history meets faith. You're listening to the Holy Land Path on the Holy Land Timeline. Here are your hosts, Eytan and Sarah.
I want you to put yourself in a very specific, highly stressful mindset for a minute here.
Okay, I'm ready.
So, imagine you're standing on this dusty, rocky ridge in the blazing Middle Eastern sun. You're holding a heavy iron pickaxe, and your job is basically to scrape away the top layer of dirt and stone.
Right, just doing the heavy manual labor before the machines come in.
Exactly. You're trying to clear the area before a whole fleet of modern bulldozers rolls in to pour a concrete foundation for a massive new housing development. So you swing the pickaxe, and it hits the limestone bedrock.
And you're expecting that, that dull, solid thud.
Yeah, but instead the rock just gives way. The ground beneath your boots suddenly sounds hollow.
Oh, wow. That's terrifying.
Right, and then the air temperature drops just a fraction of a degree because this draft of cool, ancient air suddenly rises up from a black void that just opened up in the earth.
It's like you stepped into another world.
It is. You shine your flashlight down into the hole, and you're expecting, maybe a small natural cave. But the beam of light doesn't hit a back wall. It just keeps going.
And the walls aren't rough natural stone, are they?
No, not at all. They are perfectly symmetrically carved by human hands.
I mean, that is just the ultimate archaeological adrenaline rush. You're standing right on the crust of the modern world, and you've just accidentally punched a hole straight into a forgotten chapter of human history.
That moment, that sudden, unexpected discovery, that's exactly why we're here today. Welcome to this deep dive.
It's great to be here.
Our mission for this conversation is to take you on a journey into the covenant land. We're looking at a landscape where the stones are, quite literally, crying out. They are unearthing the hidden physical realities of biblical times.
And we know exactly why you're listening.
Yeah.
You want the deep knowledge, right? You want to bypass all the dry academic jargon.
No, absolutely. Nobody wants to read a textbook right now.
Exactly. You want to get straight to the physical confirmation of the historical narratives. You want to understand the breathing, sweating, daily lives of the people who walk this land.
Right, not just as characters on a thin page, but as real people who left their actual fingerprints in the bedrock.
And to deliver that, we have curated a stack of the absolute latest archaeological dispatches and research reports straight out of Israel.
And when we say latest, we mean it. We are talking about discoveries that have been pulled from the earth and announced to the world within the last 7 days.
Fresh off the trowel, basically.
Fresh off the trowel. I love that. And our goal is to sift through the dust of these reports, to extract the profound historical and spiritual takeaways, the scriptural truths, really from 3 very distinct sites.
We actually have an overarching theme today that connects these 3 seemingly disparate discoveries. If we had to give this deep dive a title, it would be The Archaeology, the Deep Unearthing What Was Hidden.
Because the earth doesn't just swallow objects randomly, right?
No, it preserves distinct layers of the human experience. So today we're going to explore 3 different depths. First, the immense depth of human ambition and state power, hidden underground in Jerusalem.
Okay, wow.
Second, the pervasive depth of imperial power found out in the harsh sands of the deep desert. And third, we're going to literally touch the bedrock of humble, everyday faith in a Galilean fishing village.
That is quite the lineup. And that first step, the human ambition part, that takes us right back to that opening scenario I described. The sound of the pickaxe breaking through the rock.
Right. We are starting in Jerusalem with a discovery that the Israel Antiquities Authority is currently calling the Jerusalem Unknown. Or sometimes the Ramat Rachel subterranean mystery.
Let's lay out the geography and, the modern context before we go underground. This starts with a salvage excavation. Now, for anyone unfamiliar with how building works in a place as ancient as Israel.
Which is a very unique process.
Very unique. You can't just buy a plot of land and start digging a basement. The law requires the Israel Antiquities Authority, the IAA, to come in first.
Right. They have to survey the land to ensure that a new shopping mall isn't about to erase a priceless piece of human heritage.
It's this constant, really profound tension between the needs of a modern growing state and the preservation of an ancient landscape.
Exactly. And this specific project is located in an area just north of Kibbutz Ramat Rachel. Just for some geographical context, this kibbutz sits on a highly strategic elevated ridge.
It commands the high ground.
It does. It sits right between the modern city limits of Jerusalem and Bethlehem.
And the Israel Land Authority is funding a massive new residential and commercial project here. The reports indicate the footprint is huge. They're preparing 58 dunams of land, which is roughly 14 acres.
That's a massive site to clear.
It really is. The blueprint calls for almost 500 housing units, brand new schools, kindergartens, and thousands of square meters dedicated to commercial space. So the IAA sends in a team of excavators led by Dr. Sivan Mizrahi and Zinovi Matskevich to clear this 14-acre site.
And they are working in a relatively exposed, rocky area. The terrain is rough, typical of the Judean hills, and as they are clearing the topsoil and scraping the surface rock, they hit a geological feature known as a natural karstic void.
Okay, let's break down the science of that for a second, just so we are visualizing this correctly.
Yeah.
A karstic landscape is basically a topography formed from the dissolution of soluble rocks, right? In this case, limestone.
That's the exact mechanism.
Over tens of thousands of years, rainwater, which is slightly acidic because it absorbs carbon dioxide from the air to form a weak carbonic acid, it seeps into the cracks of the limestone.
Yeah, the water slowly eats away at the bedrock, widening the cracks, creating these subterranean drainage systems, and eventually opening up into natural sinkholes or caves.
So finding a small karstic void in the Judean hills that's an everyday occurrence for a geologist.
Totally normal. But the void that Mizrahi and Matskevich found wasn't normal at all. They clear the opening, they drop down into the dark, and they realize the natural dissolution of the rock just stops.
And human engineering begins.
Exactly. This karstic void served as the natural doorway to an immense, meticulously rock-cut tunnel.
When you look at the architectural survey in the IA dispatch, the sheer dimensions of this structure are staggering.
They really are.
This is a subterranean cavern stretching for 50 meters in length. That is half the length of a football field, bored directly through solid, unyielding bedrock.
The length is wild, but the volume of rock removed is what I honestly can't wrap my head around. The ceiling reaches 5 meters high in some places.
That's like the height of a 2-story commercial building.
Entirely underground. And it's 3 meters wide. You could drive 2 large SUVs side by side down this tunnel.
Unbelievable. And to carve out a space that large requires the removal of thousands of tons of rock.
And remember, this wasn't done with dynamite or heavy machinery.
Yeah.
This was done by men wielding iron chisels, working by the dim, flickering light of olive oil lamps.
Just hauling heavy baskets of stone debris up to the surface in the stifling heat.
Exactly. And they didn't just hack a rough hole either. The IAA report specifically highlights the entrance. The excavators found a beautiful, formal rock-cut staircase leading from the surface down into the maw of the tunnel.
And the walls aren't jagged. The chisel marks are described as being hewn to perfection.
Which is the primary diagnostic clue regarding who commissioned this. When you see perfect, uniform chisel marks and an entrance framed with formal architectural intent.
You're definitely ruling out a local farmer digging a root cellar.
Entirely.
Yeah.
This level of precision requires massive public funding. It requires an architect, a dedicated foreman, and a highly organized, highly skilled labor force that is being fed and paid by a central authority.
So you have this multi-million-dollar ancient engineering marvel. You have the grand staircase. You have the perfect chisel marks. And then you have the mystery, the reason the lead archaeologists are scratching their heads.
The tunnel is completely, bafflingly empty.
And in archaeology, an empty room is the hardest room to read, isn't it?
It really is. It gives you nothing to go on.
The reports are explicit about this. There are 0 diagnostic artifacts. I actually read that line 3 times, just to be sure.
It's hard to believe.
Right. No broken pottery sherds, no dropped coins, no abandoned iron tools left in a corner. There isn't a single piece of human garbage to tell us who walked down those stairs.
The tunnel was simply found, choked with centuries of alluvial soil.
Alluvial soil, that's basically sediment, right? Like loose clay, silt, sand, or gravel that's been reshaped by water.
Exactly. Over millennia, seasonal rains just washed topsoil and mud down the grand staircase, slowly filling the cavern layer by layer, burying the floor until the excavators finally breached it.
Dr. Amit Riem, he's the IAA Jerusalem regional archaeologist. He released a statement about this that really captures the frustration and awe of the team.
What did he say?
He said, "Usually we have explanations. Here we stand astounded and speechless."
Wow. When a regional archaeologist in Jerusalem, it's a city that has literally been dug up continuously for a century and a half, says he is speechless, you know you're dealing with a profound anomaly.
Because they have no pottery to date the site and no inscriptions to identify it, so they have to rely on negative evidence.
Yeah, they have to play a massive process of elimination to figure out what this massive structure was actually supposed to be.
Well, let's walk through that process of elimination. The first theory the team tested was the water system hypothesis, which makes complete sense.
Right. If you are digging a massive hole in ancient Jerusalem, it's usually to secure a water supply.
The city is famous for its subterranean water engineering, like Hezekiah's tunnel, which brought water from the Gihon spring into the city during times of siege. So they thought maybe this was a giant cistern to store rainwater or an aqueduct meant to reach a hidden underground aquifer.
It is the most logical starting point, but the physical evidence soundly defeated this hypothesis. To understand why, you really have to understand the properties of limestone.
Okay, tell me about limestone.
Limestone is highly porous. If you pour 1,000 gallons of water into a raw limestone cavern, the water will simply seep back into the bedrock and vanish.
Right, so to build a cistern, you have to waterproof it.
Precisely. In antiquity, engineers used a specialized hydraulic plaster, usually a mixture of lime, sand, water, and crushed pottery or ash to seal the walls of a cistern.
And did they find any plaster here?
The excavators scrutinized the walls of this 50-meter tunnel. There is absolutely no trace of hydraulic plaster. Furthermore, the IAA brought in geologists to map the area, and they confirmed there is no groundwater table at this specific elevation.
So there's no hidden spring to tap into?
None. And structurally, the floor of the tunnel shows zero signs of water accumulation or water erosion. It was never a water system.
Okay, so cross the cistern off the board. Theory number 2 was the agricultural or industrial hypothesis. Could this have been an underground processing facility? Like a massive wine press, an olive oil installation, or maybe a heavily fortified grain silo.
The comparative analysis defeated this one too. Archaeologists look for parallels across the ancient Near East. If you are building an underground olive press, you need specific rock-cut installations. You need a crushing basin, niches carved into the wall to anchor the heavy wooden pressing beam, collecting vats for the oil.
And none of those features exist here.
Exactly. And frankly, carving a 2-story high, 50-meter-long tunnel for basic agricultural storage is a massive misallocation of resources. It is vastly over-engineered for storing wheat or pressing olives.
Which leaves us with theory number 3, which the researchers currently consider the leading utilitarian explanation, the quarry hypothesis.
Yes. The theory is that this is a highly specialized subterranean quarry designed to extract a specific premium layer of chalk or lime rock.
And what would they use that for?
Well, this extracted rock would be used either for monumental building blocks for a nearby palace or to be burned in a kiln to produce quicklime, which is a key ingredient in mortar and plaster.
And they do have a couple of physical clues that point in this direction, don't they?
They do. As they cleared the roof of the cavern, they found a ventilation shaft cut directly through the ceiling to the surface above.
Which makes sense. If you have dozens of men working underground, burning oxygen with their torches and kicking up massive clouds of limestone dust, you absolutely need a ventilation shaft to keep them from suffocating.
Exactly. And on the floor, beneath the layers of alluvial soil, they found concentrations of quarrying chips. You know, the small, sharp debris that splinters off a rock face when a stonecutter is driving a chisel.
So functionally, stone was definitely being extracted from this space.
Without a doubt.
Okay, I understand the physical evidence for the quarry theory, but I'm looking at the architectural layout in the dispatch, and I have a major problem with it.
What's that?
If this is strictly a utilitarian rock quarry, a place meant to be dusty, loud, and hidden away, why would the builders take the time and expense to carve an elite, beautifully proportioned, formal staircase to get down to it?
It does seem totally contradictory, doesn't it?
It really does. Think about it in modern terms. If a logging company is cutting down timber in the deep woods, they build a rough, dirt logging road. They don't build a 4-lane paved highway lined with decorative street lamps just to get the trucks in and out.
That's a great analogy.
If you are just extracting rock, you cut a rough ramp. You don't carve a pristine, architecturally formal staircase unless the entrance itself is meant to be a statement. You don't put a bank vault door on a garden shed.
You've actually hit on the core tension that is keeping this classified as a mystery. Your instinct is exactly in line with the archaeologist's hesitation. It operates like a quarry, but it is dressed like the antechamber of a palace.
Right.
To reconcile that contradiction, we have to pull back our focus from the tunnel itself and look at the geopolitical neighborhood it was built in, because geography dictates purpose.
And the geography here is highly charged. We mentioned the tunnel is just north of Kibbutz Ramat Rachel.
Yes. And within a radius of just a few hundred meters from this tunnel, there are two of the most significant ancient power centers from the First Temple period, the era of the kings of Judah.
Okay, lay them out for us.
First, in the modern Arnona neighborhood nearby, previous excavations uncovered a massive Iron Age public administrative building. It was essentially a heavily fortified, centralized tax collection and agricultural storage center for the kingdom.
So massive state infrastructure is right next door, and then there is Tel Ramat Rachel itself.
Right. Tel Ramat Rachel is arguably one of the most fascinating Iron Age sites in the entire region.
Well,
Excavators found the ruins of a sprawling, luxurious royal palace built by the kings of Judah.
wow.
It sat right on the highest hill, offering the king spectacular, commanding views of Jerusalem to the north and Bethlehem to the south.
Now, I know scholars have debated the specific builder of that palace. Some attribute it to King Hezekiah, who fortified the region, or maybe his son Manasseh. But there is a strong camp of historians who believe this specific palace is the very one condemned by the prophet Jeremiah.
Yes. In Jeremiah chapter 22, the prophet delivers a blistering critique of a corrupt king, likely Jehoiakim. Jeremiah condemns him for building his palace of unrighteousness.
The text says, "Woe to him who builds his house by unrighteousness and his upper rooms by injustice, who makes his neighbor serve him for nothing and does not give him his wages."
Exactly. The prophet is criticizing a king who is obsessed with monumental, luxurious building projects while ignoring justice and exploiting his own people's labor.
So let's synthesize this. We have a massive royal palace right up the road, built by a king with a penchant for grandiose architecture. We have a state tax collection center nearby. And now we have a newly discovered, incredibly expensive, beautifully carved tunnel that looks like a quarry but feels like a palace entrance, sitting completely empty.
Right.
How do we connect those dots?
Well, when you look at the sheer scale of the investment and the abrupt nature of its abandonment, the most compelling extrapolation is that this tunnel was the beginning of a monumental royal project.
Like what?
Perhaps the king was carving out a massive subterranean escape route. Perhaps it was meant to be a hidden royal vault for the kingdom's treasury, or an underground extension of the Ramat Rachel palace complex itself.
That makes so much sense.
But whatever the ultimate vision was, the fact that there are no artifacts, no finished rooms, and only a layer of quarry chips suggests the project was suddenly, violently interrupted by a massive geopolitical shock.
A shock that would cause a state-funded workforce to drop their tools and run for their lives. And in the First Temple period, that usually means an invading superpower.
The kingdom of Judah existed in a constant state of existential dread, really, sandwiched right between massive empires. In the late 8th century BC, it was the Assyrian Empire sweeping down from the north, destroying everything in its path.
And then in the early 6th century BC, it was the Babylonian Empire under Nebuchadnezzar.
Right. Both of those empires marched their war machines right through this very landscape to lay devastating sieges to Jerusalem.
I mean, imagine the sensory reality of that moment for the stonecutters working in this tunnel. You have a massive labor force, engineers shouting orders, men hauling heavy baskets of chalk up that beautiful staircase, the rhythmic, deafening strike of iron chisels on stone.
It would have been incredibly loud and chaotic.
They have been underground for months, maybe years, bringing the king's grand vision to life. And then the work just stops. Maybe they hear the warning horns blowing from the high watchtowers of the Ramat Rachel palace. Maybe a scout rides up to the entrance covered in dust.
The warning would have been utterly terrifying. Ancient siege warfare was brutal. The Assyrians, for example, were infamous for their psychological warfare and their massive siege ramps. To hear that the vanguard of an imperial army has just appeared on the horizon.
That the dust from thousands of chariots and armored infantry is rising in the distance.
That would trigger absolute panic.
In that instant, the king's grand underground project becomes entirely irrelevant. The royal treasury stops paying the stonecutters because every ounce of silver is needed to pay for mercenaries or to bribe the invaders.
And the workers realize that if they stay, they will be slaughtered or enslaved.
So they drop the chisels, they extinguish the lamps, they scramble up the stairs and scatter into the hills.
And the tunnel is simply left behind. A gaping, silent wound in the bedrock. The invading army marches over it. The kingdom eventually falls. The rains come season after season. The alluvial mud washes down the staircase. And the earth slowly, methodically buries the king's ambition.
It hides it completely until two modern archaeologists accidentally break through the roof in 2026.
It is a profoundly haunting image. A king commands the earth to open up and hold his legacy, but the earth just fills the hole back in and forgets his name.
It perfectly illustrates our theme of the deep. This is the depth of human ambition. It is massive, it requires immense effort, but ultimately it is fragile and easily erased by the shifting tides of history.
And that idea of what the earth swallows up and what it chooses to preserve brings us to our second discovery.
Right. Because while the bedrock of Jerusalem was hiding the massive state-sponsored ambitions of Judah's kings, the surface of the deep desert was hiding something much smaller, but arguably far more pervasive.
We're moving from a state-sponsored mega-project to an individual, portable expression of power.
We are moving from the dark underground to the blinding light of the Negev desert. And this segment, which we're calling the idol in the dust, begins not with a massive construction project, but with an accidental discovery by a child.
Which is honestly one of the most enduring and charming tropes in archaeology. You can have all the ground-penetrating radar in the world, but sometimes history is just waiting for a kid with a sharp eye who is looking at the ground instead of a screen.
It's so true. The setting for this discovery is Maktesh Ramon. If you have never seen images of Maktesh Ramon, you need to look it up. It is often mistakenly called a meteor crater, but it's not.
No, it's a massive geological erosion crater right in the heart of the Negev desert.
It is 40 kilometers long, shaped like an elongated heart. The landscape looks like the surface of Mars, vast sweeping plains of colored sandstone, towering cliffs, and absolute stark silence.
It is a breathtaking but incredibly harsh, arid environment. Surviving out there requires deep knowledge of the terrain and the scarce water sources.
So recently, a group of families of paratrooper reservists from Israel went down to Maktesh Ramon for a weekend hiking trip. Just some downtime in nature. Among them is an 8-year-old boy named Dor Volinitz from the city of Rehovot.
Okay.
Now, Dor is doing what any 8-year-old boy does on a desert hike. He is scanning the ground, looking for cool rocks. He later told the Israel Antiquities Authority that his specific mission was to find, and I quote, something special to show his class.
The ultimate show and tell prize. I love that.
Exactly. So Dor is walking along the crater floor, and a specific stone catches his eye. It stands out from the typical red and brown sandstone. It has unusual stripes and a strange, symmetrical shape.
He must have known immediately it wasn't just a regular rock.
He picks it up, wipes away the desert dust, and decides it's special enough to keep. He brings it over to show his father's friend, who happens to be hiking with them. And this is where serendipity completely takes over the story. His father's friend is a man named Akiva Goldhirsch.
You could not invent a better coincidence.
Right. Akiva Goldhirsch is an inspector for the Israel Antiquities Authority. Specifically, he works in the unit dedicated to the prevention of antiquities robbery. His entire professional life is dedicated to identifying illicitly excavated artifacts and protecting historical sites in the desert.
So an 8-year-old hands a priceless artifact to the exact guy whose job it is to protect it.
Goldhirsch takes the stone. Initially, looking at the stripes and the weathering, he thinks it's a biological fossil.
Which would make sense. The Negev is actually full of ancient marine fossils from millions of years ago when the area was covered by the Tethys Sea.
But as he turns the object over in the harsh sunlight, the shadows reveal something that makes him stop in his tracks. The shape isn't natural. He sees the meticulously sculpted, deliberate folds of a carved fabric.
And the moment he sees those fabric folds, he knows he is holding human history, not geological history. He secures the object, and the IAA takes it back to their laboratories for a full analysis.
And the physical breakdown of this artifact is fascinating because of the story it tells about the reach of empires. Let's talk about the physical dimensions first. When we say statue, people might picture a life-sized marble figure in a museum, but this object is tiny.
Yes, it is a fragment measuring only about 6 by 6 centimeters. That's roughly 2.5 inches square. You can easily close your hand around it.
So small.
But what is carved into this tiny, fragile piece of stone is a highly detailed 1,700-year-old human figurine. Specifically, the fragment preserves a torso, and the torso is draped in a garment with incredibly intricate fabric folds.
And the style of that garment gave the archaeologists an immediate cultural timestamp, right?
Exactly. The garment is unequivocally identified as a hymation. This is the classic flowing outer cloak worn by Greek and Roman men of high status or divine stature.
Okay, I can picture that.
Crucially, the sculptor depicted the figure wearing this heavy cloak with no undergarment beneath it, leaving the chest exposed.
Let's talk about the skill required to carve that. I dabble in woodworking, and creating the illusion of soft, draping material out of a rigid substance is agonizingly difficult.
Oh, it requires immense talent.
To achieve the soft, cascading lines of a hymation showing the tension of the fabric hanging off the shoulder and revealing the musculature of the chest beneath it in a piece of stone the size of a matchbox requires a master artisan.
It is high-end craftsmanship, no doubt. But the real twist in the story came when the IAA analyzed the stone itself. The aesthetic is purely Greco-Roman. So the initial assumption might be that a Roman legionnaire stationed in the desert brought this statuette with him from Rome.
Or a wealthy merchant imported it from a workshop in Greece.
Right, but Dr. Nimrod Viller tested the mineral composition of the fragment.
And what did the geology tell them?
Dr. Viller determined that the statuette is carved from a light phosphorite mineral. Phosphorite is a sedimentary rock that contains high amounts of phosphate-bearing minerals. And crucially, this specific type of phosphorite is native to the Negev desert.
Wait, really?
Yes, it wasn't imported across the Mediterranean. It was quarried and carved locally.
That detail entirely changes the historical narrative of the object. If you find a marble statue of a Roman god in Rome, it just tells you you're in Rome. But if you find a Roman god carved out of local desert rock, it tells you something profound about the psychology of the people living there.
It speaks to the concept of cultural saturation.
Let me try a modern analogy to capture what's happening here. Imagine archaeologists digging up a frontier outpost in the 19th century American Wild West, thousands of miles from any major city.
Okay, I'm with you.
And in the dirt, they don't find an imported luxury good from New York. Instead, they find a piece of local pine wood, crudely but expertly carved into the shape of a globally recognized corporate logo, let's say, a perfect replica of a high-end luxury brand's crest.
That paints a very clear picture.
It shows that the influence of the dominant culture was so overwhelming that the local people weren't just buying the empire's goods, they had internalized the empire's aesthetic and were reproducing it with their own hands out of their own dirt.
That is exactly what this phosphorite statuette represents.
Yeah.
The Roman Empire didn't just conquer the Negev with swords, it conquered the local imagination. And that brings us to the identification of the figure itself.
Who do they think it is?
Based on the pose, the exposed chest, and the flowing hymnication, the experts at the IAA believe this is a depiction of the Roman high god, Jupiter. Or, more accurately for this specific region, the syncretized Nabatean equivalent, Zeus Dushara.
Zeus Dushara. That hyphenated name is the ultimate proof of an empire blending its reality with the local culture.
Exactly. To understand Zeus Dushara, you really have to understand the Nabateans. The Nabateans were the indigenous Arab masters of the desert. They are the brilliant civilization that carved the magnificent city of Petra into the rose-red cliffs of modern-day Jordan.
Oh, Petra's incredible.
They understood how to survive in the arid wasteland by mastering flash-flood agriculture and hidden water cisterns. Their chief, indigenous deity, was a god named Dushara, who was traditionally represented by abstract blocks of unhewn stone.
But then the Greeks, and later the Romans, arrive with their highly figurative, hyper-realistic statues of Zeus and Jupiter.
Right. And instead of the Romans simply wiping out Dushara, or the Nabateans entirely rejecting Jupiter, the cultures collided and merged. The empire effectively says, your supreme god of the desert, Dushara, is actually just our supreme god, Jupiter, by a different name. We are praying to the same power.
Wow, that's such a psychological tactic.
So local Nabatean artisans start carving their ancient desert god using the visual language of the Roman occupier. They carve him wearing a hymation. That is Zeus Dushara.
Before we move on to the geographic context, I have to mention that Deuterodato, the 8-year-old boy, received a good citizenship certificate from the IAA for turning the artifact in rather than keeping it on his bookshelf.
Which is fantastic.
And Israel's heritage minister, Amichai Eliyahu, praised the discovery, noting how it reminds everyone that the history of the land is literally right beneath our feet.
It is a great moment of civic engagement. But to truly grasp why a locally made idol of Zeus Dushara was sitting in the middle of Maktesh Ramon, we have to rebuild the world of 1,700 years ago. Because the Maktesh wasn't an empty hiking trail back then. It was one of the most vital economic arteries on the planet.
We are talking about the Nabatean incense route, right?
Yes. This was a legendary, incredibly lucrative trade network. It stretched from the southern tip of the Arabian Peninsula, places like modern-day Yemen and Oman, where the boswellia trees grow all the way across the brutal deserts of Saudi Arabia and the Negev, terminating at the Mediterranean ports like Gaza.
And the primary commodities moving along this route were frankincense and myrrh. In the ancient world, these tree resins were essentially liquid gold.
The economics of the Roman Empire practically demanded them. You couldn't conduct a proper sacrifice in a Roman temple. You couldn't bury an elite Roman citizen without burning massive quantities of frankincense. The demand was insatiable.
So the Nabateans controlled the supply chain. This meant the Maktesh Ramon wasn't an empty void. It was a bustling, heavily trafficked superhighway.
Just try to imagine massive camel caravans, hundreds of animals long, carrying tons of incense. You had Nabatean merchants, Roman military garrisons stationed at forts to protect the route from bandits, massive way stations, bustling inns, and water reservoirs.
It was a corridor of unimaginable wealth, constant movement, and intense cultural exchange.
And this is where the historical reality intersects with the scriptural reality in a way that I think is vital for you, the listener, to grasp. Especially for the young believers listening today who are trying to understand the roots of their faith and the world the early church was born into.
Yes, let's contextualize this artifact within the timeline of the early church. When we read the book of Acts, or the letters of Paul, we often visualize the spread of the early church in a very sanitized way.
We really do.
We imagine the apostles and the early believers walking through quiet, empty fields, having polite theological debates in pristine town squares. But the reality was visceral and crowded. When those early believers traveled to spread their message, they were walking these exact trade routes. They were traveling the incense route to get from city to city.
And as they walked, they were completely surrounded by the visual noise of the empire.
Exactly. They weren't just facing abstract philosophical arguments. They were confronting an empire that was aggressively branding the physical landscape with its paganism. They were walking past Roman garrisons with imperial eagles. They were staying at inns where merchants from Alexandria, Petra, and Rome were trading goods and praying to their respective statues.
And this tiny 6-centimeter idol of Zeus Dushara perfectly represents that environment. These small figurines were the ancient equivalent of dashboard saints or travel amulets. Every merchant caravan, every soldier, every innkeeper likely had one of these portable idols to guarantee safe passage through the dangerous crater.
To be a follower of the way in those first few centuries meant waking up every morning, tying your sandals, walking out onto the dusty trade route, and seeing the people around you clutching these local phosphorite idols of the Roman high god.
It represents the ambient, daily spiritual warfare of the ancient world.
The empire was imposing its spiritual will from the top down, trying to dictate who held the ultimate power over the desert. The idol in the dust is physical proof of the Goliath that the early church was walking alongside every single day.
Which creates the most beautiful, striking contrast as we move to our third and final site today. Because you just summarized the Roman approach perfectly, it was an empire imposing its will from the top down.
Yes, emperors and generals carving their gods into the local stone to ensure dominance.
But historically speaking, the greatest, most enduring spiritual shift in human history did not happen from the top down. It was not legislated by a Caesar, and it was not initiated in a marble temple.
Where did it start?
The movement that would eventually outlast the Roman Empire started entirely from the bottom up. It started in the mud, the reeds, and the overwhelming smell of raw fish in a working-class village on the edge of a lake.
We are heading north. We are leaving the arid, bone-dry crater of the Negev, and we are traveling up to the lush, freshwater shores of the Sea of Galilee. Specifically, we are going to an active archaeological site called El-Araj.
Right. And based on mounting evidence, excavators are increasingly confident that El-Araj is the historical location of the biblical city of Bethsaida.
Bethsaida is incredibly significant in the gospel narratives. It is explicitly named in John 1.44 as the hometown of the apostles Peter, Andrew, and Philip.
It is central to the story.
Now, before we dive into the dirt at El-Araj, I need to establish a crucial, non-negotiable rule for this segment. I am putting a boundary on this discussion right now.
I know the exact boundary you are about to draw.
I have to draw it because it is vital for our focus today. For those of you who have been listening to us for a while, you might remember that in a previous deep dive, we spent a significant amount of time discussing the excavations at Bethsaida.
We did. It was a fascinating conversation.
In that past conversation, we were completely captivated by the Byzantine era of the site. We talked extensively about the magnificent 5th century Church of the Apostles that archaeologists uncovered. We discussed the travelogue of a Bavarian bishop named Willibald, who visited the area in 725 AD, and wrote about seeing a grand basilica built directly over the house of Peter and Andrew.
We spent a lot of time analyzing the stunning glass mosaics the imported marbles, and the specific Greek inscription referencing St. Peter's that they found on the floor of that church.
Exactly. We covered the Byzantine era thoroughly, so here is the rule for today. We are not going to repeat any of that. We are leaving the 5th century behind.
It's in the past.
The basilica, the mosaics, the bishop's diary, that is what I call the architecture of memory. It is beautiful, but it is how later generations remembered the site. Today, our mission is to look strictly at the raw reality. We are focusing exclusively on the groundbreaking dispatches from the 2023 excavation season, where the archaeologists finally dug straight underneath those Byzantine mosaic floors, bypassing the architecture of memory and cutting straight down to the 1st century bedrock.
And what the earth revealed beneath the mosaics is, in many ways, far more moving and profound than the gold and marble above it.
The recent findings were presented in Washington, D.C. by Professor Stephen Notley, the academic director of the El-Araj excavation project. He detailed how the team made a strategic and highly symbolic decision. They decided to dig a new trench directly under the apse of the Byzantine basilica.
To appreciate the significance of that, you need a quick primer on Byzantine church architecture. The apse is the large, semicircular recess, usually covered by a half-dome, located at the eastern end of the church. Functionally, it is where the altar is placed. It is the geographic and spiritual focal point of the entire building. It is the most sacred spot.
So when a Byzantine architect decides where to place the apse, they aren't just looking for level ground.
Not at all. In the Byzantine period, churches commemorating biblical events were built using a principle we call the continuity of veneration. The builders deliberately calculated the placement of the church so that the altar, the most holy space, sat directly over the specific patch of dirt that the local community memory identified as the site of the miracle or the home of the saint.
Okay, wow.
To dig under the apse is to dig into the bullseye of the ancient community's memory.
There is a fascinating side note in the report about the logistics of this recent dig. The El-Araj site had recently suffered a significant brush fire. While a fire at an archaeological site is always nerve-wracking, in this case, it actually helped.
Really? How so?
The fire burned away decades of thick, impenetrable thickets and overgrowth, which exposed previously neglected structures and ancient columns that helped the team orient their new excavation grid.
It is a stark reminder that archaeology is often at the mercy of the elements, nature clearing the way for discovery. So the team begins to dig. They break through the 5th century Byzantine layer, they dig through the Roman period layers, and finally, beneath the apse, they hit the occupation layer of the 1st century. They touch the bedrock of the village at the time of Jesus.
How do they definitively know they have hit the 1st century? When you are looking at dirt and rocks, how do you set your watch to a specific 100-year window?
It comes down to the most ubiquitous, unglamorous artifact in the ancient world, pottery. Everyday ceramics are the master clock of archaeology. Over decades and centuries, the way a potter shapes the rim of a cooking pot, the way they attach a handle to a jug, or the type of clay they use, evolves in very predictable typological sequences. The excavators at El-Araj hit a distinct domestic layer that was absolutely packed with 1st century ceramic forms.
And I want to focus on what those artifacts actually look like, because the contrast is the whole point. Did they find beautifully painted Greek vases? Did they find silver goblets?
Not even close. The artifacts pulled from this 1st century domestic layer were entirely mundane, utilitarian, and rough. They found crude, domestic cooking pottery. These are thick-walled, fire-blackened pots. These were the vessels that an exhausted, everyday fisherman used to boil a simple lentil stew or fish broth over an open fire after a grueling 12-hour shift on the lake.
They also found fragments of stone vessels, which from a historical perspective is a massive diagnostic marker for the population of the village.
It is a critical cultural fingerprint. Finding a high concentration of stone vessels in a 1st century Galilean context confirms that the inhabitants were observant Jews. This ties directly into the strict Jewish ritual purity laws of the time, the halacha.
Right, let's explain how that works, because it's a fascinating intersection of religion and daily life. According to the interpretations of Leviticus at the time, domestic materials handled impurity differently. If a standard clay cooking pot comes into contact with something ritually impure, say, a dead insect falls into it, the porous clay absorbs the impurity.
And then what happens?
The pot cannot be cleansed. It must be completely shattered and thrown away.
Which is a significant economic loss for a poor family. But stone is different. Because stone is seen as a natural, unyielding element of the earth, the halacha dictates that stone vessels cannot contract ritual impurity. If a stone mug becomes impure, it can simply be washed in a ritual bath and used again.
So an entire industry of carving stone cups and bowls sprang up in the Galilee to cater to this need for purity. Finding them under the apse proves this was a Jewish household deeply concerned with following the law.
But while the stone vessels tell us about their religious observance, the most evocative artifacts they found, the items that truly anchor the site to the biblical narrative, were small, heavy pieces of metal. They found lead fishing net weights.
When I read that detail in the dispatch, it gave me pause. It just grounds the story so violently in the real world. Let's explain the mechanics of a first-century cast net to understand why these weights are here.
In the first century, fishermen on the Sea of Galilee primarily used a cast net, often called a mikmoret or a karam. This is a circular net, maybe 15 to 20 feet in diameter. The fisherman stands on the shore or on the bow of a small wooden boat, and he has to throw the net so it opens into a perfect parachute in the air.
But the crucial part is what happens when it hits the water. Fish are incredibly fast. If the net slowly floats down, the fish just dart out from under it. The edge of the net has to sink instantly, creating a fast-closing wall around the school of fish.
And that is exactly what the lead weights are for. Lead is dense, heavy, and malleable. The fishermen would take small, flat pieces of lead, fold them over the outer rope edge of the net, and hammer them tight. When the net hits the water, the lead drags the edges down to the lake bed in seconds, trapping the catch.
Finding those lead weights scattered on the first-century dirt floor is the raw reality of the apostles. It is the defining artifact of their actual lives. And I want to explore the sheer dichotomy of this excavation trench, because when you stand in that trench, you are looking at a literal cross-section of how a religion evolves.
The architecture of memory versus the bedrock of reality.
Exactly. Look at the top layer, the Byzantine church. It is majestic. It was built centuries after the fact by a victorious state-sponsored religion. It is constructed out of imported marble columns, glittering gold and glass mosaics, filled with the smell of expensive incense and the chanting of clerics in silk robes. It is designed to inspire awe.
Yeah, it certainly is.
But then you look down at the bottom of the trench, at the dirt floor beneath the apse. The actual historical lives of Peter, Andrew, and Philip were not defined by marble and incense. Their lives were defined by crude, fire-blackened clay pots and heavy, dull lead weights.
If we connect this physical reality to the spiritual significance of the site, it entirely shifts how we read the text. When Jesus arrives in Bethsaida, he doesn't walk into a pristine cathedral to issue a divine call. He doesn't find his first disciples in a place of quiet religious grandeur.
No, he walks onto a noisy, muddy, rocky shoreline.
He calls them while they're quite literally handling these exact types of lead weights. The air around them wouldn't have smelled like frankincense. It would have smelled overwhelmingly of raw fish, sweat, wet hemp nets, and stagnant lake water. These men were engaged in harsh, exhausting, blue-collar labor.
Throwing heavy nets, hauling them up hand over hand, sitting in the dirt repairing torn fibers with bone needles. It was a gritty, dangerous, and incredibly difficult life.
Professor Notley had a brilliant, grounded quote about the specific spot under the apse. He told the audience, "There's no sign saying Peter slept here, but archaeologically it's hard to get better evidence."
He is relying on that principle of continuity. The Byzantine Christians in the 5th century didn't just walk into a random field and say, let's build a massive basilica here.
Right. They built it precisely over that specific first-century ruin with the crude pots and the lead weights because the local community, the descendants of those fishermen, pointed to that specific patch of dirt and said, this is the house, this is where he lived, this is where it started.
And I want to emphasize why understanding this archaeological reality matters so much. Again, I'm thinking of the young believers listening who are trying to figure out what a life of faith looks like in the modern world. It is so easy to look at the massive history of religion, the grand cathedrals, the thousands of years of theology, and feel completely alienated. You look at a stained glass window of a saint with a golden halo and you think, I have nothing in common with that person. My life is messy and ordinary.
The stained glass sanitizes this story.
It does. But this discovery strips away the stained glass and the halos. It makes the apostles incredibly accessible. It proves that the daily service of God is inextricably rooted in the ordinary. It's rooted in daily labor. The magnificent marble church was only built there because the dirt underneath proved that the unglamorous blue-collar story was true. Faith didn't begin in a royal palace or a pristine temple. It began with calloused hands holding lead weights.
It is the ultimate proof that the divine intersects with the mundane. You don't have to elevate yourself to a place of imperial power like the Romans carving statues in the desert, or command monumental ambition like the kings of Judah carving tunnels in the bedrock to be part of an enduring story. You just have to be faithful in the everyday labor.
Which brings us to a perfect moment to step back and look at the vast expanse of history we have uncovered today. We have journeyed through 3 very different salvage operations and excavations. We've sifted through the dust of 3 completely different eras of the Covenant Land.
And as we promised at the beginning of this deep dive, the stones are indeed crying out to us. We have reached our Selah moment, a moment to pause, reflect, and synthesize the profound spiritual takeaways from the 3 depths we explored today. Because while the sites are physically separated by miles and centuries, the earth is telling us one cohesive story about what lasts and what fades.
Let's break it down, layer by layer. First, we listen to the stones of Jerusalem.
In the bedrock of Jerusalem, we found a magnificent, deeply carved, yet entirely empty tunnel with no name. It represents the ultimate vanity of monumental human effort when it is detached from a higher, enduring purpose.
A king poured immense wealth, engineering, and back-breaking labor into the rock, hoping to secure his legacy or his treasury, only for a geopolitical shock and invading army to halt the chisels instantly.
The earth simply washed in the alluvial soil, swallowed the grand ambition silently, and left it a baffling mystery thousands of years later. Human ambition, no matter how physically massive, is remarkably fragile.
Second, we listen to the stones of the deep desert.
Out in the arid, sweeping expanse of Mektesh Ramon, we saw an 8-year-old boy pick up a broken, shattered idol of the great Roman god Jupiter, buried in the dirt along the incense route.
It is physical proof that the supposedly eternal gods of the empires, the powers that seemed so ubiquitous, wealthy, and invincible to the early believers walking those dusty roads, eventually turned to dust themselves.
The empire falls, the trade route dries up, the idols break, and they are forgotten in the sand. Imperial power is temporary.
And third, we listen to the 1st century bedrock of Galilee.
In the village of Bethsaida, hidden deep beneath the grand mosaic floors of a Byzantine church, we found crude, fire-blackened clay pots and simple lead fishing weights.
And this is the profound historical irony that the earth reveals. What endures in the grand sweep of history is not the vain pride of kings in Jerusalem, nor the pagan gold and stone of the Roman Empire.
What God preserves and what ultimately changed the world is the simple, faithful, everyday labor of ordinary people who answer a spiritual call amidst their messy, working-class lives.
A king's massive tunnel is forgotten. An empire's god is shattered. But a fisherman's simple lead weight becomes the foundation for a global movement. That is the true archaeology of the deep.
It is a powerful perspective shift. It forces you to reevaluate what you consider important in your own life.
It really does. And it leaves us with one final lingering question to mull over as we wrap up today's journey. I want you to think about your own life, your own daily routine, your own workspace. When the archaeologists of the future, thousands of years from now, dig down through the layers of time to the bedrock of our generation, what physical objects from your daily labor will they find?
That's a challenging thought, because the earth will eventually claim all of it.
It will. And when those future excavators dust those objects off and place them on an examination table, what story will those items tell? Will they tell a story of vanity, of trying to build a monument to yourself? Will they tell a story of chasing the culture's temporary, easily shattered idols? Or will they tell a story of simple, everyday faithfulness to a higher call?
Something for all of us to consider the next time we pick up the tools of our trade.
Thank you so much for taking this deep dive with us today. Understanding the physical history of the dirt, the bedrock, and the artifacts of the Covenant Land doesn't just satisfy our intellectual curiosity, it deeply enriches and grounds our modern faith. We will see you on the next deep dive.
The wind is kicking up the red dirt on the lane. It's been a long July, we're praying for the rain. I see the world is changing, moving way too fast, trading in the future for a shadow of the past. But I'm standing in the doorway of a house my father made, watching how the sunlight starts to flicker in the shade. 'Cause some things never wither, that's gonna hold me when the other wonders cease. There's a comfort in the morning, there's a wisdom in the night. In the middle of the struggle, there's a flicker of the light. I don't need a map to tell me where the Spirit's gonna lead. He provides a harvest, and He's sowing every seed. From the lowest of the valleys to the highest of the hills, I'm learning how to trust Him while the world is standing still. It ain't about the headlines or the noise upon the street. It's about the narrow path beneath my tired feet. 'Cause some things never wither, and some things never fade, like the promises of glory and the price that has been paid. I'm planting all my hope in the hollow of His hand, building on the rock, not the shifting of the sand. It's a quiet kind of power, it's a deep